Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, April 17th, 2023, deep into tax robbery, tax theft season. And today, I've got some of the most widely ignored anti-federalist warnings about the power of taxation. And this is really a follow-up to last Friday's Fast Friday episode, Tax Battle, Patrick Henry versus Alexander Hamilton, on the requisition system. This was the system of taxation for the Confederation Congress under the Articles of Confederation. It's one of the primary reasons that Federalists and supporters of more energetic government, that's what they call it, they wanted more energy, more power in the general government. That was one of the reasons that they gave as why they needed this, why they needed the new convention, the new Constitution for the United States. And many people agreed with them, even opponents of the new system. But Patrick Henry specifically was in favor of the old system. He thought on this depended our political prosperity. I encourage you guys to check out that episode if you haven't. I will link to it in the show notes, of course. But anyways, first, a quick introduction to the Anti-Federalists. I think it's important if we're talking about that, just to give an overview of some of their views and some of first hear from Brian McClanahan, an article and a podcast episode that we published on our site a couple of years ago in April 2021, why we get it wrong about the Anti-Federalists. He said, if you take the standard American history course at your college or university, the professor will probably tell you that the, quote, and I like how he puts it in quotes, Anti-Federalists oppose the Constitution because it did not contain a Bill of Rights, period. That's it. Supposedly, that's all they wanted was a Bill of Rights. But there was a lot more to them. He said, part of this is true. A substantial number of so-called anti-federalists wanted a Bill of Rights, but that's only part of the story. The glue that held all of the antis together was fear of nationalization or centralization, what the founding generation called consolidation of power. Too much power in too few hands. They didn't believe in an American national government. And really, if you think about it, Brian points out here over and over, he is subtly and sometimes overtly, that the term anti-federalist was really incorrect. And many people at the time saw it as a term of art, total propaganda, because it was the anti-federalists who were taking the position that they wanted more federalism. They wanted pure federalism. And the Federalists, as I mentioned, wanted more energy, more power in a central government, less federalism. Brian thinks nationalist is a better term for the Federalists. Anyways, hear from Aaron N. Coleman over at Law and Liberty. He said there are three different types. This is reviewing Michael Faber's book on the Anti-Federalists. There are three different categories of this group of people: rights anti-federalists, power anti-federalists, and democratic anti-federalists. And he explains them in pretty good detail here. He said rights anti-federalists maintain that with the Constitution's conspicuous lack of a Bill of Rights, tyranny became an inevitability. Thus, the rights anti-federalists called for either outright rejection of the Constitution or a Bill of Rights to be amended to the document. And you'd hear this in the ratification. Well, I didn't hear it, but I would read it. You can read this in the debates of the ratification debates in the various states. Many people oppose the Constitution, quote, as it now stands. They wanted amendments. Richard Henry Lee in the Confederation Congress tried to get amendments added to the Constitution even before it was sent to the states. He'd be a great example of this. He wanted a Bill of Rights. Now, after he got the Bill of Rights, there's some letters with him, Patrick Henry, for example, that he sent that he wasn't even happy with what they got, but so be it. Anyway, so Aaron points out that power anti-federalism, as its name suggests, feared the immense power granted to the central government. They believe that the Constitution's power should be well-defined and limited only to those issues clearly national in scope, such as war and peace. Yet the scope and ambiguity, and a lot of people on the anti-federalist side, Brutus, Cato, and some of the others, repeatedly hammered home that they didn't like some ambiguous phrases. General welfare, for example. Thomas Jefferson, there's a copy of Benjamin Franklin's first proposal for an Articles of Confederation back in 1775, and Benjamin Franklin used the term general welfare there. And Jefferson's thought was, he wrote some notes on this that said we shouldn't ever use kind of ambiguous terms like this. And of course, the understanding is the more ambiguous the legal phrase, the more likely that people with power are going to use that to their advantage and try to expand their power. All artful rulers, John Dickinson once told us, who was a lead drafter of the Articles and a Federalist supporter of the Constitution years later, but he recognized the nature of power. He specifically told us that all artful rulers would, of course, try to give all of their acts as much legal semblance as possible. I'm paraphrasing that one. So Aaron says that, the antis felt it should be more well-defined. And even if they understood, and you would see this from some of the writings by Brutus and Cato and others, even where they agreed with the legal meaning of various phrases, like from James Wilson on the Federalist side, they said, well, over time, someone doesn't care. People with power aren't going to care how you describe this today. In the future, they're just going to do whatever they can get away with. Anyways, so Aaron continues. He says, yet the scope and ambiguity of the Constitution's powers, particularly over the judiciary, standing armies, and taxation, there's that general welfare clause, suggested that the framers sought to consolidate the union of sovereign states into a centralized, singular nation, really. Consolidation again. And then he said the final strand was the Democratic Anti-Federalists. They typically argued that the Articles of Confederation did not need replacing since state governments remained answerable to the people of those states. They wanted all the issues to be more localized. At the heart of this democratic anti-federalism was their fear that this new government, with only one element, the House, being directly elected by the people, squinted towards aristocracy and undermined the revolution's support of popular sovereignty, final authority of the people of the several states. So this is just interesting stuff. I do encourage you to read that full article. So in another article, I will, of course, link to this in the show notes as well, Aaron also writes that Anti-Federalists equated political liberty with active participation by the citizenry. Drawing upon history and political theory, they believe this relationship best existed in geographically small sovereign republics with a socially homogeneous population. So local, small, decentralized, a pure federal structure. And a lot of people say federal power, they think centralized power. But if we're thinking federalism, we're thinking distinct, independent sovereign states, kind of connected, in a loose confederation, at least how it was, under the notion of defense and things like that. He said by social homogeneity, I'm not sure how to say the word. Anyways, anti-federalists meant communities bound through shared fundamental beliefs. And we see this over and over and over. Here, for example, Brutus in his first Anti-Federalist paper, October 1787, he said, in a republic, the manners, sentiments, and intimate interests of the people should be similar. If this be not the case, there will be constant clashing of opinions, and the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of the other. He was a student of history. Everyone was a student of history, but he certainly made this very clear here. We're not sure who Brutus was. Some people think it's Robert Yates. Some people, very likely it was Melancton Smith, for example. Who knows? But the bottom line, it was, maybe it wasn't Melancton Smith. See, I'm forgetting some of the research I did on who that was, but we don't actually know. But understanding history, Brutus is recognizing that when you have a large republic and you have a wide range of political, economic, and social viewpoints like we do today, what you're going to have, especially when the power is centralized or consolidated and the decisions made by that consolidated power affect people who have such widely different views, you're going to have this kind of low-grade civil war of one side versus the other, trying to destroy the other side to control the entire system. And that is where we are today, without a doubt. And if we're not there, exactly, it's so close you can't even tell the difference. Anyway, so he says, this is back to Brutus, if we apply this remark to the condition of the United States, we shall be convinced that it forbids that we should be one government. And even though the system wasn't set up to be one government, the Anti-Federalists here, Brutus specifically, was warning that's how it would end up. And we still have some differences from state to state today. Obviously, not everything is California, but it's only a difference in degree. If I were to give a grade, sometimes you see these organizations start putting out grades on various issues on civil asset forfeiture or economic freedom. If it were on adherence to the original legal meaning of the Constitution, all states, all 50, would be an F. It's just that there would be worse Fs. If we don't grade on a curve, so when it comes to the Constitution, they don't follow it. None of them do. All we have to do is look at Article 1, Section 10, and we've got for decades and decades and decades and generations of people ignoring there, of states ignoring there. But side note, so can't have one government. Centralization of power was the bad thing. And Brutus says the United States includes a variety of climates. The productions of the different parts of the Union are very variant, and their interests of consequence diverse. Their manners and habits differ as much as their climates and productions, and their sentiments are by no means coincident. In other words, you got so many different viewpoints. You got to allow the people to be able to run their own lives in their own area in their own way. If you don't, what you're going to do is you're going to have this ongoing clash for control of the entire enchilada, and that's what we live under today. So Brutus, I think, did better than anyone. I think both sides, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, claim to be against consolidation or centralization of power. On the one side, they wanted more energy, but they weren't too worried that they thought the system itself would create an environment where you wouldn't get consolidation. On the other side, they were like, even if you create the proper system, well, if you give them an opening, it's going to get bad over time. But no one really explained why consolidation was bad better than Brutus, I think, and that was in his first paper. I did an episode specifically on that a few years ago, The Dangers of Consolidation, Anti-Federalist, Brutus, number 1. Anyways, here's George Mason in the Virginia Ratifying Convention again, talking about centralized power, consolidation being the problem. And of course, we're going to get to how the taxing power gives them centralized power, unlimited authority, which we can see today as well. Mason says, is it to be supposed that one national government will suit so extensive a country, embracing so many climates and containing inhabitants so very different in manners, habits, and customs? So again, religious, social, economic, political viewpoints are very different in South Carolina versus Texas, in Texas versus New Hampshire versus Montana. Well, maybe they're a little closer, but you could see the huge difference, especially when you compare, for example, Missouri and California. Two great states in their own rights, in their own ways, but unfortunately, different governments, different people. Anyways, this is supposed to be that, George Mason continues, it is ascertained by history that there never was a government over a very extensive country without destroying the liberties of the people. The larger the country, the greater the chance that the power is going to get consolidated, and over time, people's liberty will be gone. That was George Mason warning about this in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June of 1788. And here back to Aaron Coleman. He said, in other words, the Constitution's great powers over territory as vast as the United States threaten to consolidate the states into a national government as basically tools of that national government. And although the states still retain their own kind of statehood to some degree, in many, many ways, if it's not the exact same policy over the entire country, people are, even where it's different, you always find advocates and opponents trying to make it uniform everywhere. And I think this is a problem of the people themselves trying to force their way on everyone, but they do have the tool for that in the largest government in history. Aaron goes on, he says, consolidation erased the various circumstances of population, custom, economies, and geography that characterized the state's diversity, replacing it with what the federal farmer described, quote, as a uniform system of laws that conflicted with and proved detrimental to the different laws, customs, and opinions of the separate states. So again, too much power, vague, undefined powers would lead to consolidation. Where would they get the consolidation? Well, George Mason warned again here that it would be through direct taxation, through the powers of taxation, direct really or indirect, but really internal taxation that was being delegated to the new general government. And this is over a century before it got much, much worse in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. Anyways, here's George Mason. This is again in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 4th, 1788. He said, the assumption of this power of laying direct taxes does of itself entirely change the confederation of the states into one consolidated government. Merely, we can talk about necessary and proper. We can talk about the war powers. We can talk about the Commerce Clause. We can talk about the judiciary, all the different things that various people were saying, oh, too much power here. The executive branch, even Federalists like Benjamin Franklin said, this is too much power in the executive. It's going to end up like basically like a monarchy, whether in name or an elective version of that, too much power in the executive. We can look at all that, but George Mason thought that the consolidation in and of itself would be founded upon the power of laying direct taxes. He said this power being at discretion, unconfined, and without any kind of control must carry everything before it. And people who study the original legal meaning of the Constitution will point out that Federalists rejected this. No. We're selling it to you here in Virginia, for example, during this Virginia ratifying convention, Madison, Randolph, and some others. We're selling it, Harry Lee. This is not what it's supposed to do. This is not how it's set up. And then the people ratified under the understanding that George Mason was wrong. This was not unlimited, unconfined power without any control. But Mason was right in how it ended up playing out in practice. So even though the original legal meaning says Mason was incorrect, he was still warning, even though I don't think he was warning like, oh, this is just going to end up this way at some point. Maybe. He said the very idea of converting what was formerly confederation to a consolidated government is totally subversive of every principle which has hitherto governed us. So taxation was the basis. I've got a lot more on that in just a moment from Sentinel, Brutus, Federal Republican, Agrippa, some other anti-federalists. Some of them I'm sure you've heard of, some maybe not. But first I want to mention that all of these articles and original source documents, the other episode, I've got a few more that I'm going to mention. All of that will be in a show links section. That I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done for each episode. And almost every time I do an episode, I get some email or some social media comments. Hey, dude, you mentioned this article or you mentioned this episode or this speech by George Mason. Where do I find that? Well, here's where you find it. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, I publish a blog post for each individual episode. You're going to find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones. We also live stream at Rumble and Odyssey, which are awesome. We archive the video all over the place. We have the podcast edition there. Plus, there's a show link section for each episode, so you can get these links that I'm mentioning, read them in context on your own time. I should also say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys being here. Missouri Freedom Initiative, doing great work there. Cheriton Farmer, Kirk Morrison, Alt Reality. Kirk, I was just thinking about you over the weekend. For the second time in 3.5 to 4 years, I got a herniated disc in my lower back, and I know you've mentioned a few times you've missed a few episodes because of back pain, but I definitely feel you these days. Just working to take it easy, I'll tell you that. Anyways, I was thinking about you, Kirk, and I hope you're doing well. Alt Reality, Dixie Strong in Bama, Dave Simmons, Lawrence Smith in West Virginia, Haji, Southeast Michigan, Melissa Harrell, Rights are Not Tradition. That's a cool one. Richard Banks, Senator D.T., Sharon Patriot, and everyone else. I know I'm missing a few people. There's John in sunny Central California. I'll look back at the live chat a little bit later today or sometime tomorrow. I get a lot of ideas for future episodes from your feedback, so continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive. I really appreciate your input. Anyways, back to the problems of taxation, the taxing power from the Anti-Federalists. Here's a federal Republican, November 28th, 1787. So the Philadelphia Convention was over September 17th. That's the day that we call Constitution Day. That's the day that Benjamin Franklin said, let's get this thing out there to the states. Let's all support it here in this convention. But I think it's still going to end in despotism after a number of years. So here's federal Republican a few weeks later talking about the taxing power again. The very first clause in Article 1, Section 8 contains every species of power that they could possibly be vested with. He thinks Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 gives them unlimited power on its own. And of course, the supporters of the Constitution, and I could make the case, I've done some episodes on this, would tell you that the General Welfare Clause does not give them unlimited power. It is very limited. It's very specific in what it means in law. But if the people aren't on board with that, or the people actually just go with whatever the politicians and the judges tell them, or the judge politicians in many cases, then of course government's going to continue to grow. So we were warned that this would be used for unlimited power. He said in it, power is given them, quote, to lay and collect taxes. He highlights lay and collect duties, imposts, and excises to pay debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. He highlighted lay, collect, and general welfare. General welfare is the phrase that Thomas Jefferson didn't like when he was reading Articles of Confederation, the proposal from Benjamin Franklin in 1775. I have not found anything in his letters back and forth during the ratification debate saying the same about the Constitution. Maybe he was convinced that, well, okay, now I understand this better, or maybe he thought there were other issues to deal with. He certainly wanted a Bill of Rights. Anyways, a federal Republican continues, says, this power may, if exerted in its extent, reduce the several states to poverty and nothing. And he's not necessarily talking about the several states regarding the state governments. The people of those states, if they're going to take whatever they want, lay and collect whatever tax they want for whatever they determine is for the general welfare, well, it's going to be pretty unlimited, and that's where we are today. Largest government in history, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Here's Agrippa in Agrippa's 12th paper, well, 13th, it depends how you count it. It's Agrippa number 12, part 2, over at teachingamericanhistory.org. Also cites this Article 1, Section 8. They also have the unlimited right to imposts and all kinds of taxes as well to levy as to collect them. They have indeed very nearly the same powers claimed formerly by the British Parliament. British Parliament claimed, if we look at the history of the arguments of why there was a revolution in viewpoints and a war for independence, it was because, as Thomas Paine told us in the American Crisis, his first one in December of 1776, you can't even make a deal with these people, even if they're arguing to kind of back down on a few things. As long as the British Parliament continues with the Declaratory Act of 1766, where they claim power over us in all cases whatsoever, then they have unlimited power. You're always going to be on your knees in that type of a situation. And here Agrippa's basically saying this general welfare clause is almost the same, or it will be used in almost the same way for power over us in all cases whatsoever. And if they don't use the general welfare clause like that today, they certainly use the supremacy clause like that way today, even though the supremacy clause is almost only limiting federal supremacy to those acts pursuant to the delegated powers of the Constitution. They see it as supremacy no matter what the feds do, until the feds tell us that the feds shouldn't have done the thing in the first place, which rarely happens, maybe every few decades. So he expected them to have unlimited power. He said, can we have so soon forgot our glorious struggle with that power, the British Parliament, as to think a moment of surrendering it now, citing the principles of the Revolution? Why would you give them something that could, even if they're telling us that good people are going to use this in the right way, we got to be really careful about this. Just barely a decade ago, less than a decade if you think about the Treaty of Paris, there's this long, bloody war against the largest government in history, and one of the big reasons was, well, unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. We got to stay away from that kind of thing. That was the warning, and the power of taxation was a big part of it. If you think about the Stamp Act, Patrick Henry's resolutions at 29 years old against the Stamp Act in May of 1765. He specifically was talking about the power to tax. John Dickinson as well was talking about the power to tax, a direct tax on consumption, on individuals, that individuals would directly have to pay. Patrick Henry in his resolutions in Virginia specifically said, look, if we're going to do this tax, it has to be on our own consent under our own legislature. You're not authorized to do this. And if you do, we are not bound to obey it. John Dickinson said the same thing later that year when he urged the people to refuse to comply with the Stamp Act. If you comply with the act by using stamped papers, he told us, you rivet and fix perpetual chains around your unhappy country. And this was about what was considered a very small tax, but it sets the precedent for them to do the internal taxation, which, well, is very problematic. Here's a Sentinel in his 5th paper, December 1787. Again, all of this will be linked to in the show notes. He said, it is as absurd to say that the power of Congress is limited by these general expressions to provide for the common safety and general welfare as it would be to say that it would be limited had the Constitution said they have the power to lay taxes, etc., at will and pleasure. So he's saying, in practice, again, just saying it's for the general welfare is going to have the same amount of limitation as, well, they can lay taxes for whatever reason they want. And I think Sentinel was probably on something there. Here's Brutus, I believe. This is... Oh, no, this is Federal Republic. That was Brutus. Let me look and see. I got to scroll up. I got so many of these. Yeah, that was Brutus number 6. The previous one was Sentinel. Back to Federal Republican. Let's see where that highlight is here. The power of internal taxation given to Congress in the foregoing clause is a very unjust and improper one. It has been hinted in some publication that impost will defray all our national expenses. We heard over and over during ratification debates, Connecticut and elsewhere, that, oh, you don't have to work. We need this just in case. But really, they're not going to have to do any internal taxes, no direct taxes, no individual tax. No way. That's never going to happen because they don't need it. We'll be able to operate this government just on excise tax, duties, imports, trade, and things like that. And then it'll be fine. Nothing to worry about. And this is what Federal Republican is talking about here. The power of internal taxation is very unjust and improper. It is hinted that the impost will defray all our national expenses. This is a proposition perfectly absurd. Will not the support of a standing army, a navy, etc., be a prodigious addition to national expense? To say that this government will not be an additional expense to the country is an assertion to which common sense would never assent. And here, just to make sure I got the right one, Cato, in his 6th paper, also discusses this. He says the doctrine of taxation is very important, and nothing requires more wisdom and prudence than the regulation of that portion which is taken from and of that which is left to the subject. So you got to be really cautious when you're talking about giving government power to take from people. We say taxation is theft, robbery, extortion, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. It's bad. But he's saying, like, look, we're recognizing that we're going to be okay with some level of taxation. They preferred oftentimes a different mode of it, but they thought it was also playing with fire. He said, if you anticipate what will be the enormous expense of this new government added also to your own, little will that portion be which will be left to you. Sometimes this stuff is hard to read. He goes on, he says, I know there are politicians, I love that he calls them politicians who believe that you should be loaded with taxes, Hamilton, in order to make you industrious. And perhaps there were some of this opinion in the convention, but it is an erroneous principle. For what can inspire you with industry if the greatest measures of your labors are to be swallowed up in taxes? This is a great kind of free market view. We don't get a lot of this type of discussion at that time. I mean, there certainly is some, but pointing out that the more the government takes from you, the more they're taking your labor, the more that they're reducing your output, the more that they're reducing your motivation to create. And so I thought that was a nice addition to discuss. But he also went on to argue against that same Federalist position that the government would be able to exist solely on trade taxes from trade, excises, imposts, etc. I covered this in an episode. Insupportable burdens is what he called them. Anti-Federalist, Cato, number 6. Again, I will link to this in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Here's how Cato put it, for example. This is delusive, talking about the Federalist position that the government would just be able to exist on tariffs, for example. This is delusive. For this government to discharge all its incidental expenses, besides paying the interest on the home and foreign debts, will require more money than its commerce can afford. Expected them to have to do much more than what we are being sold that what they would have to do based on the powers delegated to them. And here's Federal Farmer in his 3rd letter. He said, when I recollect how lately Congress, conventions, legislatures, and people contended in the cause of liberty, he's citing the revolution. We see a lot more citation of the revolution, mentioning of the revolution, the glorious revolution, that glorious effort to resist the British and defeat them from the Anti-Federalist side. And that just, to me, is very fascinating. When I recollect how they supported the cause of liberty, he says, and carefully weighed the importance of taxation, I can scarcely believe we are serious in proposing to vest the powers of laying and collecting internal taxes in a government so imperfectly organized for such purposes. I mean, if you think about how he's saying this, even in the parlance of the day, he's basically saying, like, look, we had this incredible conflict with the British over a period of decades, and it went into a war against the largest government ever. We won. It was a horrible struggle. We're struggling to get past that today. Part of the reason we did this was internal taxes. It wasn't just about representation, even though that was a rallying cry. But we were against the idea of internal taxes in a large, far-off government. I can't even believe that this is seriously up for consideration. He's flabbergasted at this idea. This is Federal Farmer. A lot of people think it was Richard Henry Lee. We know for sure it was not. Well, with almost certainty it was not, but we don't know for sure who it was. Federal Farmer continues, I am sensible also that it is said that Congress will not attempt to lay and collect internal taxes. Again, the argument, the power's there. No. They're not going to use it like this, was the argument from the Federalist side in some situations. It's not going to be used. Don't worry about it. Everything's good. We've got checks and balances. You can throw the bums out if you need to, etc. Well, that didn't work. He said that it is necessary for them to have this power, though it cannot probably be exercised. And I think the Anti-Federalists were more on top of the idea that as soon as you give them the power for just in case, you can be almost certain they're going to use it for just in case all the time and make it worse and worse and worse. It's the maxim that humans always try to expand power when it's in their hands. Federal Farmer continues. He actually recognizes that it probably won't happen in the short term, at least. He says, I admit that it is not probable that any prudent Congress will attempt to lay and collect internal taxes, especially direct taxes. But this only proves that the power would be improperly lodged in Congress and that it might be abused by imprudent and designing men. I think that really is the summary of the entire argument. Like, if you think that they need to have the power, but it's very unlikely anyone will use it because it's probably not a good idea, why give them the power in the first place? Because that in and of itself tells us that someone is going to use it in a bad way at some point. Now, TJ Martinell just wrapped up an entire series covering the Federal Farmer letters that we published. This is on his third paper, Federal Farmer, Constitution Creates a Strong Tendency to Aristocracy. And this is what we're citing from here as well. I will link to that in the show notes. I want to close out with a couple from Patrick Henry that I think are pretty awesome. Here he is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June 9th, 1788. He said, we ought to be exceedingly cautious in giving up this life, this soul of money, this power of taxation to Congress. In a way that only Patrick Henry can do. Of course, what powerful check is there to prevent the most extravagant and profligate squandering of the public money? What check will there be when you give them this power in the General Welfare Clause, this internal taxation power, this direct taxation power? They are going to squander the public money. And this is before the depreciation of the Federal Reserve as well. He said, I never wish to see Congress supplicate the states, but it is more abhorrent to my mind to give them an unlimited and unbounded command over our souls, our lives, our purses, without any check or restraint. And of course, historians, Federalists, etc., Constitution experts will tell you, well, the Federalists rejected this view. Patrick Henry was incorrect. And maybe he was under the original legal meaning of the Constitution, but he certainly warned that the power that was being delegated was going to be used in an unbounded, unlimited way. And here he is one more time, June 5th, 1788. He said, I beseech gentlemen at all hazards not to give up this unlimited power of taxation. And even if you argued, well, it's not unlimited, it's not supposed to be unlimited, man, if we just looked at the amount that they're taking from us all the time, it's pretty intense. Patrick Henry continues, in this scheme of energetic government, the people will find two sets of tax gatherers, the state and the federal sheriffs. This, it seems to me, will produce such dreadful oppression as the people cannot possibly bear. He said the federal sheriff may commit what oppression, make what distresses he please, and ruin you, describes the IRS almost perfectly. They may commit what oppression, make what distresses they please, and ruin you with impunity. He said, thus, thousands of your people will be most shamefully robbed. And that's kind of a precursor to the taxation is theft mentality or viewpoint, the phrase. Patrick Henry looked at it as robbery under this system. And there's nothing that helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support the work and you want to help us reach and teach more people about these original foundational principles, both sides as much as possible, and then what to do when government refuses to follow the limits given to it, which is constantly, you can support us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I'll look back over in the chat a little bit later. I'm going to give my back a little bit of a rest here in a couple of minutes. But I really appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time on the path to liberty.